Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and the time has come. You've seen the announcement, you've seen the unboxing, but today we can present our full review of the brand new NVIDIA RTX 5090. Hitting the market at £1,939, or basically $2,000 US, there has been non-stop speculation about just how fast this card really is. So in today's review, we're going to be definitively answering that question, while also looking at things like DLSS 4, multi-frame generation, power draw, the brand new Founders Edition design, and a whole lot more. So then, just to set the scene, if you've been living under a rock for the last 3 weeks, NVIDIA announced the brand new RTX 50 series back at CES 2025. The RTX 5090 and RTX 5080 are launching first on January the 30th, but we are also getting a 5070 and a 5070 Ti, which will be coming next month. This video though is all about the flagship RTX 5090, and boy, do we have a lot of data to go over. I do want to quickly recap the core spec though, just to kind of put everything into context. So starting off with the core configuration, the RTX 5090 is built on the new GB202 die, measuring 750 square millimeters, though it's not actually a full implementation of the silicon. Instead, we find a total of 170 streaming multiprocessors, or SMs, and each SM still holds 256 CUDA cores, meaning the 5090 has an eye-watering total of 21,760 shaders. We also find 170 RT cores, 680 tensor cores, 680 texture units, and 176 ROPs. This time around, however, there's no die shrink, as GB202 remains fabricated on TSMC's N4 node, as per the RTX 40 series. As such, rated clock speed is not increased this generation, and is actually touted slightly below that of the RTX 4090, with the 5090 delivering a rated 2407 MHz boost clock compared to its predecessor's 2520 MHz boost. The memory configuration though has seen significant upgrades. The RTX 5090 now comes equipped with a super wide 512-bit memory interface, paired with 32 gigs of brand new GDDR7 memory running at 28 gigabits per second, and that puts total memory bandwidth at a staggering 1,792 gigabytes a second. Considering those large increases to die size and core count, but with no node shrink, it's perhaps unsurprising to see power draw has also increased significantly, this time boasting a 575 watt TGP. For my testing today then, I am using our brand new GPU test system for 2025, and this is powered by MSI. For full details, do check out the link in the description below, but it's packing an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D, and we've paired that with MSI's MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi motherboard. We've also got 64 gigs of Kingston FuryBeast DDR5 6000 CL30 latency, and all testing has been done with the MSI MPG 321 URX QD-OLED 4K 240Hz monitor. Before we dive into all of the benchmark data though, I do kind of just want to lay out the plan for this video so you know how things are going to be structured. I think the whole introduction of DLSS 4 has definitely added some confusion, especially because basically all of NVIDIA's first-party benchmarks had some form of DLSS or other included in the numbers. But in this video, I'm going to start first with 12 rasterized games, and that means no ray tracing and no upscaling. After that, I'm going to look at 8 ray trace games, only 2 of which will have upscaling, and that's because they're the 2 path trace games, being Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong. After that, I'm going to look at DLSS 4 separately, including various looks at super resolution, ray reconstruction, and the new multi-frame generation mode. So hopefully that makes sense. I wanted to keep things kind of nicely compartmentalized so things don't bleed into each other, and you know whatever numbers you're looking at are directly comparable to other numbers on the chart. The final thing to say is that in this video we are focusing on 1440p and 4K. If you are an absolute madman and want to spend $2,000 to game at 1080p, yes, I did test that resolution, but all of the data for that and every single one of our benchmark graphs is going to be in the full written review over on kitguru.net, and I'll leave a link to that down in the description and in the pinned comment. Kicking off with Alan Wake 2 then, I did actually encounter some frame time issues in this game with the RTX 5090, and that does affect the 1% lows, as you can see. I've spoken with a couple of other reviewers who also experienced something similar, so I think it's likely a driver issue that just needs to be ironed out for this game. The average frame rate still scaled in line with our expectations though, with the RTX 5090 hitting 129 FPS at 1440p, and that makes it 29% faster than the RTX 4090. Up at 4K, we're now looking at 75 FPS on average, still with dodgy 1% lows, but the average is almost a 20 FPS increase over the RTX 4090, so that works out as a 31% improvement. Black Myth Wukong is up next, and it shows you just how demanding this game is when the fastest consumer graphics card in the world can only manage 87 FPS at a native 1440p using the cinematic preset. That works out as a 24% bump over the RTX 4090 or a 47% uplift compared to the 4080 Super. Up at 4K, even the 4090 can't even secure a locked 60 FPS. It falls just shy to 58 FPS on average, and with the 1% lows at 47 FPS. That makes this Blackwell flagship 30% faster on average when compared to the RTX 4090. As for Cyberpunk 2077, at 1440p the RTX 5090 delivers 190 FPS exactly, so about another 40 FPS on top of the RTX 4090, and that makes it 25% faster. It's also 59% ahead of AMD's current flagship, the RX 7900 XTX. Stepping up to 4K then actually reveals the single biggest performance increase over the 4090 that we will see all day. The 5090 averages 101 FPS, making it 43% faster than the 4090. Final Fantasy XVI is another very GPU heavy title, and at 1440p the RTX 5090 hits 92 FPS, giving it a 25% lead over the 4090, while it's 47% faster than AMD's 7900 XTX. We then average 61 FPS at 4K, which is a 28% improvement over the 4090, or a 61% lead over the 7900 XTX. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5, this one doesn't scale quite as well as the other titles we have assessed so far. Now, we're still able to hit 235 FPS using the Extreme preset at 1440p, but that's just a gain of 18% over the 4090. Even at 4K, the jump in performance is still relatively subdued, with just another 18% margin on show, given the RTX 5090 manages 183 FPS on average, and that also makes it just 36% faster than AMD's 7900 XTX. Ghost of Tsushima does fare a lot better though, and at 1440p the RTX 5090 manages to average 164 FPS, and that gives it a 25% lead over the RTX 4090 and a 48% advantage over AMD's current flagship. Stepping up to 4K does give the RTX 5090 more breathing room, as its average of 111 FPS works out as a 31% gain over the 4090, and it's now 60% ahead of AMD's fastest consumer graphics card. Up next though is Horizon Forbidden West, where we again saw lower than expected performance scaling. It's likely that CPU bottlenecks are at play here, even on the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, as the 5090 delivers just a 17% gain over the RTX 4090 at 1440p. Now that does increase to 23% at 4K, though that is still on the lower side compared to the rest of our games tested, but it is also a 64% gain over the RTX 4080 Super. Moving on to The Last of Us Part 1 though, this does get the RTX 5090 back on track with an average of 176 FPS at 1440p, making it 29% faster than the 4090, and it's 65% ahead of the 7900 XTX. Up at 4K, the 5090 is able to stretch its lead further. Now it's 36% faster to the 4090, which is a healthy performance increase and an average frame rate of 101 FPS. As for A Plague Tale Requiem, here the 5090 averages 164 FPS at 1440p, which equates to a 25% uplift over the 4090, or a 59% gain over the 4080 Super. 4K resolution once again sees Nvidia's new flagship extend its leads over the rest of the field. This time it's 34% ahead of its direct predecessor, and it's 78% faster than the 4080 Super. Now, interestingly, despite being a very GPU-heavy Unreal Engine 5 title, Senua Saga Hellblade 2 actually shows lower performance scaling than I was expecting from the 5090. It's 21% faster than the 4090 at 1440p for instance, and 56% ahead of the 7900 XTX. Even at 4K though, it can't do better than a 23% uplift over the 4090 with an average frame rate of 66 FPS. That also makes it 61% faster than the 4080 Super. Starfield is another GPU-heavy title where we see disappointing improvements compared to the 40 series, or specifically the 4090. At 1440p for instance, the 5090 is just 16% faster, and while it is possible, I don't think we are CPU limited here, as GPU utilization was reporting at 98%. Even at 4K, the gain is just 21% over the 4090, which works out as just an extra 16 FPS in our benchmark run on the forest area on the planet Jemison. Lastly though, we close out our rasterized benchmarks with Total War Warhammer 3, and this actually scaled a lot better than I thought it would, being a slightly older DX11 title. At 1440p for instance, the 5090 can crank through 254 FPS on average, and that makes it 22% faster than the 4090. At 4K, however, the average of 153 FPS works out as a 36% improvement over the 4090, while it's also 66% faster than AMD's RX 7900 XTX. Looking now at the 12-game average results, at 1440p, the 5090 comes in 22% faster than its direct predecessor, the RTX 4090, in terms of rasterization performance. That also makes it 54% faster than the AMD RX 7900 XTX, and it's a 57% uplift compared to the RTX 4080 Super. Of course, this GPU is really designed for 4K and it does scale best at this resolution, now delivering an extra 29% performance over the 4090, while it's 64% and 71% faster than the 7900 XTX and 4080 Super respectively. Just to further break down the performance versus the RTX 4090, as I know this will be a key comparison, here we can see the relative performance gains for the 5090 over its predecessor. At 1440p it ranges from between 16% up to 29% faster. As mentioned, those margins do increase at 4K, where we only see a single title showing a gain of less than 20%, while 6 of the 12 games tested do show improvements of at least 30% over the RTX 4090. Using that average frame rate data presented just there, here we now look at the cost per frame data using the UK MSRP launch prices for each GPU. With an asking price of £1,939, I really don't think anyone was expecting the RTX 5090 to come in as a cost per frame champion, so it's no surprise to see that the overall value is fairly poor here. I really don't think value is what RTX 5090 is all about though, and so I personally don't see this as much of an issue. Even considering the price increase over the RTX 4090, cost per frame does at least still see a small improvement, 11% at 4K to be exact. It's also a similar story when looking at cost per frame using current retail prices. RTX 4090 stock is increasingly hard to find, so prices have crept up to around the £2,000 mark here in the UK, and as such the RTX 5090 looks like even better value, though it is still second bottom on our chart. Next up then, we're going to move on to ray tracing performance, and just as a reminder, we're only using upscaling here for the two Path Trace games, that's Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong. Everything else was tested at native resolution. Kicking things off then again with Alan Wake 2, there is a clear golfing class when looking at ray trace performance in this game. Only a handful of GPUs can actually deliver playable performance with ray tracing enabled. Of course, the 5090 is top of the pile and it comes in 28% faster than the 4090, though the 1% lows are still in need of fixing, as we mentioned earlier in the video. Up at 4K, the RTX 5090 manages 55 FPS on average, and that makes it 30% faster than the 4090, while it's 83% ahead of the 4080 Super. Black Myth Wukong is similarly punishing, and there's not many GPUs that deliver playable performance with ray tracing at very high settings. Here, the 5090 delivers 95 FPS on average at 1440p, giving it a 30% lead over the 4090. Up at 4K, the 5090 now hits 57 FPS, stretching its lead to 37% over the 4090. Compared to the next fastest GPU on the chart, which is the 4080 Super, the Blackwell flagship is 86% more performant. As for Cyberpunk 2077, at 1440p the 5090 is capable of 102 FPS using the RT Ultra preset, though do note I do manually disable upscaling. That makes it 24% faster than the 4090, while it's well over double the performance of the 7900 XTX. 4K resolution once again shows the 5090 extending its lead over the 4090, coming in 30% faster with an average frame rate of 54 FPS. F124 also delivers similar gains, so the ray traced effects aren't as demanding, so the 5090 is actually able to hit 155 FPS with everything maxed out at 1440p. That puts it 30% ahead of the 4090, and it's 82% faster than the 7900 XTX, but with substantially better 1% lows. As we step up to 4K, the gap between the 5090 and the rest of the pack only widens, given it's now 34% faster than Nvidia's previous flagship and almost double the performance of the 4080 Super. Meanwhile, in Ratchet Clank, it is a similar story. The RTX 5090 comes in 26% faster than the 4090 at 1440p, while AMD's fastest consumer GPU, the RX 7900 XTX, is nowhere to be seen. At 4K, the 5090 is now 28% faster than the 4090, and it also gives it a 79% lead over the 4080 Super. Next up is Returnal, which only includes ray trace shadows and reflections, which is relatively light by modern standards, and that allows the 5090 to cruise to 155 FPS on average at 1440p, though that's a relatively small 22% gain over the 4090. Up at 4K, it manages 95 FPS, which is a slightly wider margin of 28% compared to its predecessor, while it's 66% faster than the 4080 Super. As for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, this one does feel a bit like an ancient relic at this point. I've been benchmarking it since the days of the RTX 20 series, but it is still interesting to see how performance scales in games that only have a single ray traced effect. At 1440p, the RTX 5090 hits an eye-watering 235 FPS with no DLSS required, and that makes it 25% faster than the 4090. Even at 4K, we're looking at 140 FPS on average with no upscaling, and that translates to a 27% gain over the 4090. Lastly, we finish up with Star Wars Outlaws, which is a game with ray tracing at the heart of its engine. Even then though, the 5090 displays relatively meager gains over the 4090 at 1440p, given it is just 21% faster, delivering 112 FPS on average. 4K does scale slightly better, this time showing the 5090 with a 25% advantage over the 4090, but that's still one of the less impressive results we have seen today. Overall performance with ray tracing enabled scales very similar to what we saw from our rasterized numbers. Now, I was actually expecting a slightly bigger gain relative to the 4090 when enabling ray tracing, but at 1440p, the 5090 is 25% faster, and that increases to 29% faster at 4K, which is of course the exact same margin we saw in our 12-game rasterization average. Interestingly, overall value does actually look considerably better when looking at the cost per frame data, based this time on our ray trace numbers. Granted, the 5090 is still hardly jaw-dropping in this regard, but its performance being so much better than anything AMD has to offer makes it a much better value if ray tracing is your primary concern. The picture though does change slightly when looking at the cost per frame data based on current retail pricing, mainly because a lot of GPUs have received hefty discounts over the course of their life cycles, but the 5090 is still middle of the pack at 4K when looking at the numbers based on our ray tracing performance. Moving on though, it is now finally time to talk about DLSS 4, and there is a lot to cover given just how many announcements NVIDIA made about this technology back at CES. Before we come on to multi-frame generation though, there is actually one piece of news I want to cover first, and that is actually the move to a new transformer model for DLSS super resolution and ray reconstruction. According to NVIDIA, the company had simply pushed the old DLSS upscaler as far as it can go in terms of image quality, so switching to the new, more complex transformer model instead of the older convolutional neural network or CNN model uses, in NVIDIA's words, 2 times more parameters and 4 times more compute to provide greater stability, reduced ghosting, higher details, and enhanced anti-aliasing in games. The good news here is that this actually applies to all RTX GPUs. That's right, the transformer model is compatible with cards all the way back to the RTX 20 series, and it works with both super resolution and ray reconstruction. For the visual comparisons then, I'm starting off in Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K with super resolution set to performance mode with ray reconstruction turned on, so we are directly comparing the two models head to head. In my view, the transformer model definitely increases visual fidelity across a range of comparisons. We can see reduced animation ghosting, for instance, in this example here, while overall level of detail does look that bit sharper. I also tried it in Alan Wake 2 and it helped remove some of that oil painting style look from ray reconstruction too. Granted, in some scenes there's not always a huge difference, but I'd say this is definitely a welcome upgrade, especially because it runs on all RTX GPUs. It is worth making clear, however, that there is a slight performance cost compared to the CNN model. In Cyberpunk 2077, ultra settings, path tracing on, 4K with super resolution performance and ray reconstruction enabled, I saw a 4 FPS reduction using the transformer model on the RTX 5090. However, the cost is actually greater on older GPUs, with the RTX 3090 for instance dropping from 35 FPS to 29 FPS in the same exact scene. Or putting it another way, the cost for a 5090 to use the transformer model is just 4% frame rate, whereas for a 3090 it increases to a 17% cost over the CNN model. That may mean it isn't always viable for those on older GPUs, but I still think it's great to see this improvement being made for all RTX owners. Multi-frame generation, or MFG, is what's new and currently exclusive to the RTX 50 series, however. As we know, FrameGen debuted with the 40 series and it uses AI to insert one generated frame between each traditionally rendered frame, boosting your frame rate. Now, NVIDIA has not only overhauled the FrameGen model itself, but it can actually generate up to 3 frames for every traditional rendered frame. First thing we need to point out though is that it's actually very hard to accurately capture this for video. After all, with an extra 3 frames being generated, the frame rates do go very high and we're only doing a 60 FPS video here. To get around that as best I can, I've done all B-rail capture with VSync enabled at 120Hz, and then we can slow the footage down by 50% so you see each frame. For all performance testing, I of course had VSync off so you're getting the pure raw performance, but this is the best way we can show you the visual quality. As we know then, an AI generated frame isn't always a perfect match for one that's been cranked out on the CUDA cores, and there are still visual issues if you know what you're looking for. The UI, for instance, can still be problematic, especially when moving over different game world objects with some fizzling and distortion on show. I also noticed some fizzling around the rear of my car when driving at speed in Cyberpunk, and translucent objects or things intersecting with transparencies can also cause visual difficulties, such as with this hologram tree near Cherry Blossom Market, which was shimmering quite noticeably. That being said though, if you're properly playing the game and not focusing on pulling out the visual issues, I do think the quality is generally pretty good. I'd say the increase to visual smoothness is well worth the occasional hiccup too, though everyone will of course have their own preference when it comes to the visual quality. In terms of the frame rate numbers though, I'm going to put those up on screen now. Here I first tested with MFG disabled using DLLA, then I used MFG disabled but with super resolution performance, and then I tested MFG 2X, MFG 3X, and then MFG 4X, all using super resolution performance as well. It's worth stressing here that the idea isn't always to whack on MFG 4X for the highest frame rate, rather the options for 2X, 3X or 4X are more designed to give you options to get as close to your monitor's maximum refresh rate as possible. After all, with FrameGen and the added latency, which we will get to shortly, there's no longer a benefit to exceeding your monitor's max refresh rate, so if you have a 144Hz display, it's likely that MFG 2X is all you need. For those using 4K 240Hz screens, however, MFG could well be required to hit that refresh rate target. Speaking of latency, however, this is a key area of discussion given that FrameGen actually diverges from what we traditionally expect when we get a frame rate increase. That's because despite the frame rate going up, latency does not go down. It actually increases given how the algorithm has to buffer one traditionally rendered frame in order to squeeze the AI generated frames in between. To show how latency scales in a complete apples to apples test, I used DLAA instead of super resolution, first with MFG off and then with the 2X, 3X and 4X modes. You can see that when used without super resolution, latency is only going up, and that's despite the frame rate increasing. This is a clear paradigm shift then compared to what we'd previously expect, as usually if your frame rate goes up, the latency comes down. We can see a clear example of this when looking at super resolution scaling in this chart. The lower the internal resolution, the higher the frame rate, the lower the latency. That's why NVIDIA claims that DLSS 4 will improve latency versus native performance, because super resolution will drop it significantly to the point where even if you add FrameGen in the mix, the latency is lower than what you see at native resolution. In a nutshell then, while MFG 4X does give you the visual fluidity of 240 frames per second, it does not improve the latency to match, so you are left with a similar, if not slightly worse, feel than if the technology wasn't enabled to begin with. Just to show another example of MFG in action, I also tried out Alan Wake 2. Now, as mentioned earlier in the review, I have been having frame time issues with the 5090, but this game does still show the raw average FPS increases that can be had with DLSS 4. Once more though, latency is increased with the technology enabled. We see 51 milliseconds of PC latency when using MFG 4X alongside Super Resolution Performance mode, compared to 38 milliseconds when just using Super Resolution Performance. Again, that means there is a disconnect between the visual fluidity and the input, and how sensitive you are to this can vary from person to person. The thing I would say there though is that I do find first-person games are a lot more challenging when enabling frame generation, as it kind of feels like you want that raw, faster input, whereas third-person games, I personally find it a lot more manageable, but again, this is all entirely subjective. Moving on though to Hogwarts Legacy, this is a slightly different example, and it's actually very interesting because it gives us an insight into what MFG can do in CPU-bound games, and that certainly applies to the area of Hogsmeade that I was testing in. As we can see here, there is absolutely zero performance gain to be had when moving from DLAA to DLSS Super Resolution performance on the RTX 5090, simply because we are so CPU bottlenecked even at 4K. It's only when enabling MFG that the frame rates increase, first to 115 FPS with MFG 2X, up to 229 FPS with MFG 4X. It's also interesting that as the 5090 is so CPU bottlenecked, the PC latency is only increasing by smaller amounts too, though it is still going up rather than going down as we typically expect from a frame rate increase. The snag is of course that the frame pacing in Hogwarts Legacy has always been terrible. You've probably already noticed the stuttering in the video, and MFG cannot fix that. Here, for instance, we're comparing Super Resolution Performance Mode without MFG to the same upscaling but with MFG 2X enabled. Yes, the overall frame times are lower as the frame rate has increased, but the consistency is still very poor and there's a number of large spikes. That's not MFG's problem, however, that is just central to the game and how it renders. Hopefully it'll get fixed one day, but it does go to show if a game is having frame time issues, MFG is not going to fix that. As the final area to touch on then, I am going to include some comparisons to the RTX 4090, which of course only supports frame generation rather than multi-frame generation, so you can have the insertion of one AI generated frame rather than up to 3, as with the 5090. As such, that means you can get significantly higher frame rates with the 5090, and of course that is how NVIDIA devised its 2x faster marketing slides that generated all that discussion earlier in the month. I'm presenting this data with otherwise no comments. If the idea of generating more frames is valuable to you, then great. The 5090 can often double the frame rate of a 4090 with MFG 4X. If not, we can move on.
If you're looking for a new chair, then definitely go and check out boolies.co.uk. They offer a whole host of gaming and office chairs that come in a variety of different finishes and different colours.
The final area I want to test then on the RTX 4090 is something new for us, so I'm very open to suggestions here if you have other ideas or things we can do differently. I am talking though about AI testing and productivity. So here I'm actually going to be looking at a couple of AI tests from Procyon. We also look at Geekbench, and then I look at render performance from Blender 4.3.0 along with V-Ray. Starting off though with our Stable Diffusion XL FP16 image generation test. As expected, the RTX 5090 is decently faster than the RTX 4090 here, to the tune of 33%, and that does scale in line with our games testing. I also run the AI text generation benchmark, which is designed to measure LLM performance with the 4 AI models that we can test in Procyon. Gains over the 4090 do vary slightly depending on the model, but Llama 2 performance has improved by 37% to pick out one example. I've also included the Geekbench AI Pro benchmark, and here the half precision metric shows the largest gains for the 5090 with a 25% increase, though the other two show gains of less than 20%. I'm also making a return to the Blender benchmark, measuring the performance of the classroom render scene using Blender 4.3.0, and this shows a 31% gain over the RTX 4090. Finally, I'm going to run the V-Ray GPU benchmark using the RTX path, and this shows another 36% gain for the 5090 over its predecessor. That does bring us though to the end of all of our benchmark data, but before we wrap up this video, I do want to take first a closer look at the RTX 5090 Founders Edition itself. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail here as we already did an unboxing and first look earlier on in the week, but I specifically want to take a quick look at the new cooler design. Unlike the RTX 4090 for instance, the fans are obviously now both positioned on the front side of the card, rather than one on the top and one on the bottom. NVIDIA calls this the double flow-through design, as the PCB has been moved to the dead center of the card itself. Here you can actually see an exploded view of the design from NVIDIA, and it really is quite the feat of engineering. By shrinking the PCB to something barely bigger than my palm, NVIDIA has been able to place it centrally with the GPU and memory cooled by a 3D vapor chamber. 5 heat pipes then extend from either side of the vapor chamber, and the 2 fans are able to blow air directly through the fin stack with far less resistance than the previous Founders Edition design. NVIDIA also claims that this new innovative thermal design has allowed them to shrink the card now, so it's only a dual slot thickness again when the 4090 was a triple slot card. It also measures 304mm long and 137mm tall. In terms of its thermal performance then, it really is quite something to see a dual slot graphics card deal with 575 watts of heat in such an effective manner. Over the 30-minute stress test, the GPU core settled at just 72 degrees, while the VRAM was a touch warmer, but still well within safe limits at 88 degrees. Despite running at admittedly very reasonable temperatures, the 5090 Founders Edition does not compromise on fan noise levels either. I mean, it's not silent by any means, hitting 39 decibels on our sound meter, and that was with fan speed reported at 46% or 1585 RPM. Again though, for a dual slot card that draws 575 watts of power, I think this is very impressive indeed. The only snag though is that I did hear some coil whine during my testing. It wasn't obvious the whole time, but especially at say lower resolutions and during loading screens, it was audible, and here's a quick sound test. Moving on though to look at the clock speed behaviour of the Founders Edition model, it ran at a pretty consistent frequency during my 30-minute stress test. Initially it boosted up to 2670 MHz before settling down at around 2630 MHz after 3 or so minutes, where it held for the remainder of the test. This is about 50 MHz slower than what my RTX 4090 typically achieves, so it's very interesting to see slightly lower clock speeds with Blackwell. As for power draw and efficiency though, this is where for me things get very interesting. As a reminder, I actually use NVIDIA's PCAT tool, which allows me to measure power draw of the graphics card only on a per game per resolution basis, so we can be very granular with our data. As a reminder as well, if you want to see every single one of the games we tested, looking at both power draw and performance per watt, all of that data is in the written review on kitguru.net with a link down in the description and in the pinned comment. For this video, however, we're going to be focusing on the 4K data, and here we can see power draw in each of the 12 games I tested. Obviously, it is very high at 4K. It doesn't always hit over 500 watts, but in titles like Plague Tale Requiem, Cyberpunk, and then The Last of Us Part 1, we are very close to that 575 watt figure, which I honestly wasn't expecting for rasterized titles. On average then, over those 12 games tested, the GPU is pulling just under 515 watts, a huge amount of power, and that works out as a 30% increase over the 4090 and a 79% increase over the 4080 Super. Of course, that data means we can work out performance per watt, where we take the frame rate from any given game and divide that by the power draw figure. Given that the 5090 is 29% faster but draws 30% more power than the 4090, efficiency is actually slightly worse given the performance per watt is 5% lower. Versus the 4080 Super 2, it's 71% faster at 4K but pulls 79% more power, resulting in worse efficiency. Now, you may well not be bothered by that, but I personally find it fascinating that Nvidia has clearly had to push things further than ever before to squeeze out that extra performance over the 4090 to the point where performance per watt has actually gone backwards due to such an increase in power draw. Lastly though, we're going to close out with a look at total system power draw. Again, this scales in line with what we've just seen. The RTX 5090 is clearly more power hungry than the 4090, with the whole system pulling 171 watts more. So there we have it, that is my RTX 5090 review in as much detail as I could possibly produce for you guys. Obviously we've gone over a heck of a lot of data and I can't recap everything in this conclusion, but be sure to use the video chapters and the timestamps down below if there's something you particularly want to check out. As we found though, the RTX 5090 is indeed the new fastest consumer graphics card on the market, offering gains around 29% over the RTX 4090 when testing at 4K, and that makes it 64% faster on average compared to AMD's current consumer flagship, the RX 7900 XTX, while it's also a 71% uplift over the RTX 4080 Super. Of course, whether or not you are impressed by those generational gains is going to be entirely up to you. 30% might sound like a solid improvement, or it might be a disappointment. From my perspective as a reviewer, I'm just trying to give you guys as much data as possible so you can make your own informed decisions, and I like to think I've done that today. It is, however, fair to say that the gen-on-gen uplift is definitely smaller than the jump from, say, the 2080 Ti to the 3090 or the 3090 to the 4090, but I also have to wonder if we need to adjust our expectations. After all, we keep hearing how each node is getting more and more expensive to manufacture, with technological advancements getting harder and harder to come by. With that in mind, it definitely does seem like the lack of a node shrink is the limiting factor for the RTX 5090, with Blackwell remaining on TSMC's N4 node. That means to get the extra performance from the 5090, NVIDIA increased die size by 23% over AD102, adding in 33% more cores, while also making the change to GDDR7 memory. Perhaps most eye-catching is the increased total board power, hitting an eye-watering 575 watts, a 28% increase over the RTX 4090's 450 watt TBP. Pricing has obviously also increased, now hitting almost £2,000, which definitely means it isn't for the faint of heart, but I also don't think the target market are really going to care. Yes, it is £300 to £400 more expensive than the RTX 4090, but the way I see it, if you are considering a 5090, you either want the fastest consumer graphics card for gaming and you probably don't care what it costs, or you're going to use it for professional applications, in which case the extra performance is likely going to pay for itself over time. The reality is NVIDIA just has no competition in this market space, so they can effectively charge what they want, as if you want the best of the best, it is the RTX 5090, so you do have to be prepared to pay for it. Then there is also, of course, the DLSS 4 to factor in, specifically multi-frame generation, or MFG, which is an exclusive feature for the RTX 50 series. I spent a fair bit of time testing that feature as part of this review, and generally I think if you already got on with frame generation from the 40 series, you'll probably find a lot to like with MFG. It's been particularly useful in enabling 4K 240Hz gaming experiences that wouldn't otherwise be possible, such as high frame rate path tracing in Cyberpunk 2077, and with the growing 4K OLED monitor segment, that is certainly good news. However, it is definitely not a perfect technology, as the discerning gamer will still notice some fizzling or shimmering that isn't otherwise there, while latency scaling is still backwards compared to what we've come to expect, in the sense that latency actually increases as the frame rate increases with MFG, rather than latency decreasing. That means MFG won't be for everybody. Some people may find it problematic as the feel of the game doesn't always match up to the visual fluidity of the increased frame rate. Taken as a whole though, at the end of the day, yeah, I do think the RTX 5090 is a solid enough overall package. Sure, there are concerns about the increase in pricing and power draw, but realistically, I just don't think that the target audience for this card are realistically going to care. For them, it's all about the increase to performance, and while the circa 30% gains over the 4090 at 4K aren't going to blow your mind like the jump from a 3090 to a 4090, I still think it's a decent enough gain, considering the fact that, while maybe not completely dead, Moore's Law is certainly well out the door. I will, however, be very interested to see how performance scales as we head down the 50 series stack, where you can't always just pump up the power draw and pump up the core count by 30% to get your increased performance. For that analysis though, we will of course have to wait and see what the 5070 and 5070 Ti can bring to the table when they launch next month. That is going to bring us to the end of this video though, guys, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts on this GPU down in the comments below. Is it a massive flop, or are you going to buy one? Do let me know your thoughts. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. If you want to carry on the conversation as well, you can join us in our Discord server, which is linked in the description, and while you're there, you can help us out by picking up one of our t-shirts, such as the ones on screen. Lastly, if you're feeling particularly generous, you can even consider backing us on Patreon. But that's it for me, guys. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.